Let's do one more session before we go into our afternoon break. I want to bring David Fee up here. David is Senior Actuary at the Pension Review Board. We're going to update some pension review funding guidelines. These were recently updated in July of 2024. And David's going to spend a little bit of time covering that here for us. If you got a chance to read the bios, too, about any of our speakers, just know that David absolutely loves public speaking. I saw that, too, in your bio. So with that, please help me welcome David Fee.
So I'm David Fee, the Senior Actuary at the Texas Pension Review Board, here to discuss the revised pension funding guidelines. So today I'll talk about why we have the pension funding guidelines, what the process was to update those guidelines, what the changes are to the guidelines, and what parts went unchanged. So why do we have pension funding guidelines at the Pension Review Board? So the purpose is to provide guidance to public retirement systems and their sponsoring entities in meeting long-term pension obligations. We want to foster communication between your systems and the sponsors to determine a reasonable approach to responsible funding. So why do I keep highlighting the word sponsor? Because it's not about your systems being on an island and trying to come up with solutions on your own. It should be a joint process between you and your city or sponsor. So the process has gone on about a year to update the guidelines. We started about a year ago, and we spent a few months reviewing the previous guidelines, and then we spent more months drafting, revising, and editing for the next few months. In January of this year, we presented an initial draft to the Actuarial Committee, and then spent 2 months collecting stakeholder feedback from you all. We presented updated drafts in May, and then spent another 2 months collecting feedback from you. And just last month, we finalized the updated pension funding guidelines. So now let's go over what the changes are. So much of Guideline 3 stayed the same, but a new addition to Guideline 3 calls your attention to a critical change in the funding soundness restoration plan requirements. They take effect in 2025. So in new Guideline 3, it says starting September 1st, 2025, the funded ratio will be a factor in the triggering mechanisms of the FSRP requirement. So you might be thinking, well, the added funded ratio, it'll just work the same as funding period always has. It takes consecutive valuations on the wrong side of the threshold, and that'll trigger an FSRP. But when it comes to funded ratio, you can have it can just take one valuation report, and that will trigger an FSRP without consecutive valuations. So if you have a funded ratio below 65%, you can have an immediate triggering of an FSRP. Now, if your funding period is under 30 years, it's the same as it's always been, you're not going to trigger an FSRP. But if you're on the wrong side of the funding period threshold at 30 years, and you're on the wrong side of the FSRP statute now with a funded ratio of 65%, if both those things in combination are in the valuation report, that one valuation report triggers an FSRP. So another new change to Guideline 4 is regarding overfunded plans. So we added this provision because previously there was no guidance for systems that were overfunded, and we're expecting many of you to be overfunded any day now, and so we wanted to make sure there were guidelines in effect. So once a system reaches 100% funded, at minimum, contributions should continue to cover the normal cost until the funded ratio exceeds at least 120%. So why should you continue funding even after you reach full funding? Because your liability is going to continue to increase with normal cost and interest each and every year. And so you want to keep funding that normal cost so that you can stay at that full funding level. If you were to stop funding, once you reach full funding, you won't be fully funded for very long. And when it comes to the sponsor side, if the contributions decrease on the sponsor side, it's very easy for them to decrease the pension contributions. It's not so easy to get them back to the previous rate. All right, so now we're to the good part, the target funding period range. So previous guideline 4 said 10 to 25 years, that's your target funding range. New guideline 5 says if the funding period is not decreased to 20 years or less by September 1st, 2035, the funding policy should be updated to target a funding period of 15 years by September 1st, 2040. So the key figures in there are 15 years and September 1st, 2040. So why 15 years? What we're trying to get to is a place where you're avoiding negative amortization. So negative amortization means that in the upcoming year, your unfunded liability is expected to grow. And so most of our systems have payroll growth assumptions, meaning that when you calculate your funding period, you're assuming contributions are going to increase every year as your payroll increases. And so if you have a payroll growth assumption like that, generally it's somewhere between 18 to 23 year funding periods where you start to break even and start to actually pay down your unfunded liability. If you never get to 18 to 23 years, you're never going to hit that point. Your unfunded liability is just going to continue to grow. So if for our systems with the more aggressive assumptions, with higher expected returns, higher payroll growth assumptions, you're looking at probably 18-year funding period you need to reach before you're breaking even and starting to pay down your unfunded liability. For the more conservative assumptions, if you have a lower investment return and a lower payroll growth assumption, then you're looking at closer to 23 years, with many of the systems somewhere in between. But that's just the break-even point where it's not growing. We want to get to a point where you're actually paying down your unfunded liability. And so 15 years is a good target, because the way it works, you're at 30 years, say you're at a 30-year funding period in 2025, your unfunded liability is going to grow each year for at least 7 to 12 years. And come year 15, honestly, you're just getting back to your initial unfunded liability. So if your unfunded liability is $10 million with a 30-year funding period, it's going to go above that 10 million mark for the next probably 15 years. And it's not until you get to that 15-year funding period where you're going to be back to your original unfunded liability of 10 million. So we're just trying to get back to that point. No longer growing your unfunded liability. Now, why September 1st, 2040? We want systems to stay on track. So with FSRP requirements in place, all systems should be at a 30-year or less funding period by 2025. And if you have achievable assumptions, there's no reason that over the next 15 years, you can't get down to a 15-year funding period. Now, it may not be linear, it may not happen in a straight line. You may not go from 30 years in 2025 to 29 years in 2026 to 28 years in 2027. But over a 15-year period, even if it's going up and down on a bumpy ride, you should get to that 15-year funding period. So this next slide kind of keys off the last slide. This is when benefit enhancements should not be adopted. So previous guideline 4 went along with the previous funding target range. Previous funding target range was 10 to 25 years, and so the previous guideline 4 said you shouldn't enhance benefits if the resulting amortization period would be outside that target. Similarly, new guideline 6 says that after September 1st, 2040, benefit increases and contribution decreases should not be adopted if the proposed changes cause a material increase in the funding period and if that exceeds the greater of 15 years. We did add a wrinkle in this, or the average future working lifetime of current active owners. So under the previous guidelines, you were at a 10-year funding period, you wanted to enhance benefits, you could take it back up to a 25-year funding period. Now it's going to be a more moderate increase. You're at a 10-year funding period, you would bring it up to a 15-year funding period, or in some cases, your average future working lifetime. So why 15 years? It's the same as we talked about on the previous slide. We're trying to get out of that negative amortization to a point where you're really paying down your unfunded liability. But why does it matter how long current members are expected to continue working? So what we want to avoid are benefit enhancements going in for current members that aren't being paid for by those current members. You don't want the next generation having to pay for the previous generation's benefits. So as an extreme example, say your average member is 60 years old and benefit enhancements get put in place for those 60-year-olds. Chances are those members are not going to be paying for their own benefit increases. It's going to be left to the next generation. But on the flip side, another extreme example, if your average member is 30 years old, well then there's probably plenty of time for them to pay for their own benefit enhancements. So the new Guideline 7 has to do with tiers. So this involves systems that have multiple tiers, where usually what happens is established members get a certain level of benefits, but newer members get a lesser tier of benefits. And so new Guideline 7 says, benefit decreases and contribution increases should not be adopted without studying how the resulting normal costs compare to the contribution rates of each tier, and board discussion of whether members in each tier will receive a benefit that's worth more than their contributions. So you might notice that this guideline doesn't say you can't make the change. It's making sure you're informed as a board of how that change will impact each and every tier of members. So again, previously we were talking about benefit enhancements. Now we're talking about benefit decreases, contribution increases, the opposite. So why do we want to compare the normal cost to the contribution rate? So this is what we call the employer normal cost. So say your members are putting in 14% of their paycheck, and they have a normal cost of 18%, that spread of 4% we call your employer normal cost. And that's the estimated benefit to you of your pension benefit above your pay. But let's say new members are still putting in 14% of their paycheck, but their normal cost is only 13%. Well then, their benefit is arguably worth less than what they're paying in. And we're not saying you can't put that into place, but we want to make sure anytime you're making these changes that you're fully informed and fully discussed exactly how that's going to impact each and every tier of members. So now we'll get into the guidelines that went unchanged. So guideline 1 says the funding of a pension plan should reflect all obligations and assets. That probably sounds obvious, but if you think about things like a 13th check or things that don't get paid every single year, sometimes the inclination is, well, we don't need to value that in our liabilities. But even with something like a 13th check, you want an assumption in your liability that it's going to be paid every so often. Guidelines 2 and 3, honestly, every system is pretty compliant with those, so I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on those. Guideline 4, the unchanged portion, says actual contributions made to the plan should be sufficient to cover the normal cost and to amortize the unfunded liability over as brief a period as possible, but not to exceed 30 years. So as of 2025, we're still talking 30 years. But remember, under the new guidelines, 2040 is 15 years. So there's nothing wrong with being at a 30-year funding period in 2025 when you're heading down in the right direction to a 15-year period over 15 years. It's all about the direction you're heading. Now, on the other hand, if you're at 30 years in 2025 and you stay at 30 years for the next 15 years, then your unfunded liability is going to continue to grow, and you're never even expected to get to a point where you're beginning to pay down that unfunded liability. But on the other hand, if the direction is going down, there's nothing wrong being at 30 years now, as long as you're going toward that 15-year funding period, so that even though in the upcoming year you're going to have a growth in your unfunded liability, you can see that in the future, soon you're going to actually be getting to a better place. So former Guideline 5 is unchanged, other than that it's renamed Guideline 8. And that says the choice of assumptions used by a system should be reasonable and should comply with applicable actuarial standards. So whenever you hear the word reasonable, I want you to think achievable. So if you have a 7.5% expected return, I want you to wonder, just make sure you think that really is achievable for your system. So 7.5% net return would probably mean you need 8.1, 8.2% gross returns so that you can pay for the expenses and still have that 7.5% net return. So is that reasonable to you? It is if you really believe that it's achievable. And the former Guideline 6 is unchanged other than it's now renamed Guideline 9. And that says public retirement systems should monitor, review, and report the impact of actual plan experience on actuarial assumptions at least once every 5 years. So for systems over $100 million in assets, you're required by law to do both an actuarial audit and an experience study. The systems under $100 million, you're not required by law to do an experience study, but we still recommend that you consider it. So I think it's worth a conversation with your actuary to look at how much it would cost to do an experience study and whether you think it'd be beneficial for your plan. Because what you want is your assumptions to be as good as possible so that you know that you're actually not going to have surprises year to year in the future. So I look forward to watching all of your systems on a steady march down to a 15-year funding period. I am 48 years old right now. I'll be 63 in 2040. So I will consider it a wonderful birthday present, 62nd birthday present, if you send me an actual evaluation report that says you have a 15-year funding period. But I have several birthdays along the way, so if you want to send it early, it would be a wonderful 50th birthday present, 55th. I'll let it be up to you. And I do want to remind you guys that we have a report coming up, I believe, next month regarding the funding soundness restoration plans and how the new requirements have taken effect. And it specifically goes into detail for 14 systems that have reduced their funding period to below 30 years from above 30 years since those new FSOP requirements went into effect. So I'd encourage you all to read that. It's got examples of what 14 different systems have done to reduce their funding periods and may be helpful for some other systems that are looking to reduce theirs. So with that, I will take any questions if there are any.